All right. So, I just finished The Narrow Road Between Desires, and I feel as though there are some things I want to say about it, so I shall do so. This is Pat Rothfuss's first book in, what has it been, like 10, 12, 13 years, and it is unfortunately a bit of a disaster. So, let's talk about it. So, for those of you who don't know, Narrow Road Between Desires is a adaptation or rewrite of a short story that Pat Rothfuss previously published in 2014 entitled The Lightning Tree over in this Rogues collection edited by George R.R. Martin. So that story was again published in 2014, and Pat Rothfuss's stated goal in this story is to basically upgrade it, tweak it along the edges, and make it more to his liking. Let me just say, as a starting point, that I hate that idea. This is a story. It's a published written word, right? And you shouldn't just, as an author, change that. It's not a video game where you're going to release a patch after X amount of time to improve it. You publish the words, they're in they're in print, people have read it, and that should be it. You should move on. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle killed Sherlock Holmes in the short story The Final Problem. And Sherlock Holmes stayed dead for a solid 10 years until, for his own reasons, mainly to do with money, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes back. And the way he did that back is by writing a new story. He pushed his story forward, he retconned, get me wrong, it was a bit strange how Sherlock Holmes came back to life. But the key is, he didn't go back and rewrite The Final Problem so that Sherlock Holmes could then survive, right? Because what he had written and what he had published had already been forged, right? So it couldn't just be tweaked, that since the author had changed his feelings about what should have happened in that story. And I think that's really important, because if he had done it the Pat Rothfuss way and gone back and brought Sherlock Holmes back to life by, rewriting The Final Problem, then all of a sudden we have two versions of The Final Problem. And it's like, okay, this is the original version, this is the second version. Very confusing for the reader, very confusing from just a plainly historical perspective, and it's just a mess. So honestly, already going into The Narrow Road Between Desires, wasn't happy. I didn't think this was a good idea. But, if you know me well, you'll know that I do love Pat Rothfuss, and I think that his prose is unparalleled. I've told many friends that he is most likely the best living English language author that we have right now. We haven't heard from him in a long time, so in spite of everything, I went into this book sort of hoping for the best, hoping for a little more Rothfuss, which we, again, haven't had for some time. Unfortunately, it proved to be a bit of a disaster, and I feel confident saying that every single change that Pat Rothfuss made between his original story in 2014, The Lightning Tree, and this story, The Narrow Road Between Desires, was for the worst. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire book here. I'm just going to point to two things and talk about why I feel that Rothfuss's changes to the book were completely misguided and ultimately made the story worse. If you haven't read it, both Lightning Tree and The Narrow Road Between Desires have the same basic premise. It's basically a slice of life story of the minor character Bast from The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. A sort of day in the life of kind of story, where we get to see Bast hanging around the Waystone Inn, interacting with people around the town, mainly children, having sex with a bunch of people, and going about his daily routine and daily business, right? So it's sort of a window into that character Bast, and that's what we get in both the Lightning Tree and Narrow Road Between Desires, right? And Narrow Road Between Desires doesn't do much to change those central facts. Now, in terms of what Pat changed, I want to talk first about a character called Emberly. Now, Emberly, according to the main character Bast, is the third most attractive girl in the village where they're living, and a big part of the original Lightning Tree was Bast bartering with a young man named Kostrel for the location of Emberly's bathing spot, right? The special place she went out from the village in order to go and have a bath, right? So Bast bargains for that information. He bargains hard so that he can get it, so that he can go and he can watch her bathe. So, when I first read that, I felt, it's not the first time I felt this way about a lot of Pat Rothfuss material, it felt pretty anime, right? It felt like one of those anime episodes that you got, certainly back in the late 2000, early 2010s, where you had the hot spring episode, right? You know the episode if you know anything about anime. The episode where they all go to a hot spring and the girls want to just enjoy the hot spring, but then some boys want to go and look at them while they're naked, right? So it sort of gave me that kind of energy. And what happens in the story, in the original story, is that Bast goes off to see Emberly bathe. He climbs up on a tree. He peeps on her. Then he falls off the tree, but Emberly apparently sees him fall off that tree, and rather than being disturbed or, I guess, angry at that situation, she's like, oh, okay, well, we can have sex. And so they do. Right? So that's how it goes in the original Lightning Tree. In the Narrow Road Between Desires, the same thing does happen. Bast bargains for Emberly's bathing spot. He goes and falls out of the tree, and once again they have sex. But there's a twist, because in a couple of pages after that, Bast goes back and has a conversation with this young boy named Kostrel, the one he got the bathing information from, and he finds out that actually Emberly wanted Bast to know where she had been bathing. And Emberly wanted him to come and see her so that they could have sex with each other. So therefore, it's consensual. Now, I can see why Pat Rothfuss might have wanted to change that, right? I don't know what kind of thing he does in his personal life. He certainly puts a lot of effort into projecting a certain image of himself. But look, if you were a horny anime fan in the, early 2010s or so, right, then chances are you love those hot spring scenes, you loved watching the damn harem animes and all of that stuff. And, you write your book and you have, your fairy character peep on a girl, and then she's like, oh, sure, I'll have sex with you. And it's like, oh, yeah, awesome, sex is great. And, you write that, and then, 10 years later, you look back on it and you feel kind of embarrassed. But there's a problem, right, with Pat Rothfuss going back to, quote-unquote, fix that scene to make it more consensual and less, I guess, rapey, right? Because, it is kind of rapey in the original, I guess. But nevertheless, there's a problem, right? And that is that, well, let's use our brain here for a second. So, Pat Rothfuss has now written a character, right? This female character, who apparently had a crush on this character Bast, right? So she had a crush on Bast, right? And so she made a plan. And that plan was to get a 9-year-old boy, right? Or however old Kostrel is. Kostrel, I don't think... He's a boy, right? He's definitely described as being, small. So she got a 9-year-old boy to tell Bast about the location where she would be naked, in the hopes that Bast would then take that information and go over there so that they could have sex. And she did that instead of just talking to Bast or saying, hey, Bast, would you like to go on a walk in the woods? No. She arranged for this illicit bath rendezvous so that they could have sex. The more you think about it, the stupider it gets, right? And no matter how you interpret the character of Emberly, it doesn't really make sense, right? Because if you interpret Emberly as being this girl who is too shy to approach Bast directly, that's why she went through Kostrel. It's like, okay, she's too shy to approach him directly, but then she's gonna arrange a sex rendezvous rather than just like a date, right? Is that what we're going for? Or if it's just like, oh, she's an empowered woman who's like, in control of her sexuality or something like that. If you want to go for that route instead, then it's like, okay. And she therefore is involving a 9-year-old boy in that, right? She's getting a 9-year-old boy to pass her sex messages on. That's what she's doing, right? So this is the problem, right? Which is that Pat Rothfuss, he's embarrassed by what he wrote 10 years ago, right? With the whole thing with the anime hot spring thing that he did. And instead of just moving on, right? Instead of just like, okay, I'm going to write something better next time, he tried to go back and put lipstick on a pig, right? He tried to go back and be like, okay, I'm going to make that scene right this time. I'm going to make it feminist. But you can't. You can't make a feminist version of the hot spring peeping scene. It's not possible. That scene is just inherently about, it's about, getting horny and like looking at a girl that's naked, right? So this attempt to make it consensual makes Emberly into a, quite frankly, ludicrous character who does not make sense. Granted, she wasn't much of a character before, right? She was certainly very forgettable before, but this is still absolutely ludicrous. And you know what it is that Pat Rothfuss now has a porn plot in his story, because that's the only place where a storyline, a character with that kind of motivation, those kinds of actions would make sense in pornography, right? It's like, oh, hey, here, meet me there for the naked times. Come on, Pat. And, this is the problem with, trying to go back to a previous work and make it quote-unquote right. It just comes across as being inherently silly and unserious. Let me give you an example here. So there's another part of the Lightning Tree and the Narrow Road Between Desires where Pat Rothfuss added one line. And let me just talk about that here. So first of all, in the story here, the mayor's daughter comes and asks Bast what gender her little kitten is, right? So it says here, Bast says he hesitated, he'd rather not lie, not here, but he hadn't promised to answer her question, hadn't made any sort of agreement at all with her. That made things easier, a great deal easier than having an android mayor visit the Waystone demanding to know why his daughter suddenly knew the word penis. I tickle the kitten's tummy, Bast said easily, and if it winks at me, I know it's a girl. This satisfied Viet, and she nodded gravely. So that's the Lightning Tree version. Now, in Narrow Road Between Desires, Pat added a line to that. Let me see. So again, it begins in the same way. What wouldn't be easy was an angry mayor storming through the front door of the Waystone demanding why his daughter suddenly knew the word penis. Still, it was simple enough to answer. Bast would rather tell the bigger truth, the smaller one anyway. Bows and dresses don't matter much, he said. She decided she's a girl, so she's a girl. So, again, the intention of that line is very clear. Pat Rothfuss apparently went back and read his story and said to himself, wait, I implied that it was the cat's biology that determined their gender, but gender, however, is a social construct. Therefore, I have to adjust what Bast said in order to, take that into account and make it, again, quote unquote, right. I'm sure his motivations behind wanting to do that are good, right? He's read maybe some things about what J.K. Rowling has been tweeting about or whatever it is, and he wants to, sort of push back in whatever way he can by being, I don't know, one of the good ones or whatever you want to say. But preachy writing is preachy writing, whether it's in Narnia or in Temerant, or whatever he calls his name, his world. If you're going to preach at your audience like that, it's instantly going to come across as being ham-fisted and lame. And that's what that line is, Pat. It's lame. It's lame because of the way that thing is phrased and pitched, and the so blatant intention beneath it takes you straight out of the story, right? It completely rips you out. Because you read that, and immediately it's like, oh, Pat Rothfuss making a stand against transphobia, going against the likes of J.K. Rowling and all the TERFs out there, and all of a sudden, I'm no longer in Pat Rothfuss's world. All of a sudden, I'm on goddamn Twitter. I also think it's kind of lazy and cheap. It's sort of going for a cheap applause. It's like, okay, Pat, if you really want to do the right thing vis-a-vis like you versus other authors in terms of trans representation and all that, going back to one of your old stories and having Bass say transphobia is wrong, or inserting that other line about there's a special drink that does hormonal therapy in the village. They drink a herb and apparently they can transition. So instead of doing that, why not write a new story with a transgender main character, right? Why not do that, right? Rather than just I'm going to go back and I'm going to put some throwaway lines into my old short story there, right? Why not make it real, right? Why not, as a fantasy author, right? Rather than just saying, oh, they drank the tea to transition. Okay, make a short story, or make I don't know what you're making nowadays, but make something with a transgender main character. Do it, right? Rather than going for this cheap stuff. Because that is really cheap, right? Any hack author can have their main character turn to the proverbial fourth wall and be like, transphobia is wrong. We should not do that. Or racism wrong. Is wrong. We should not do that. Anyone can do it. And that's easy. But Rothfuss, you're one of the best authors of our time, or at least you were. So why don't you do something better than that, right? Because honestly, I look at what I see in the Lightning Tree, and I can't help but think that it's a little pathetic. Anyhow, so those are my two things. I appreciate everyone who's listened so far. This channel is probably not going to be updated very often, but I'll say like and subscribe anyway, because even though I will probably not upload something again for a very long time, when I do it, you will definitely want to know. Probably. Anyway, later everyone.